Welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia. I'm Ruth Shaber, a proud supporter of the library. Tonight's author event, along with many other critical and enriching programs, is made possible only through generous private support. If you've not already done so, I hope you'll consider making a gift and helping the Free Library advance literacy, guide learning, and inspire curiosity for all Philadelphians. Tonight's lecture is the Sandra Shaber Memorial Lecture, named in memory of my mother, who was a devoted lover and longtime supporter of the Free Library. My family and I couldn't have thought of a more fitting tribute to her, and each year we select an author that would have been of great interest to her. This year's author is no exception. I so wish Sandra was here so I could discuss this amazing book with her. Tonight we are proud to welcome Heather McGhee, whose book, The Sum of Us, documents her 2021 odyssey across the American landscape of inequality, and won wide acclaim for its empathetic and incisive imagining of a future that could offer more than our current racial paradigm. A New York Times bestseller, longlisted for the National Book Award, and named one of the best books of the year by numerous media outlets, it was recently adopted as a podcast on the Obama's Higher Ground network. One of the nation's foremost experts in economic and social policy, McGhee is the chair of the board of directors at Color of Change, the United States' largest online racial justice group. She is also the former president of the inequality-focused think tank Demos, where she currently serves as a distinguished senior fellow. Ms. McGhee will be in conversation this evening with Tracey Matisak, noted journalist and broadcaster. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out to spend your Tuesday evening with us. We certainly hope that you'll find this to be an enlightening and informative conversation. And as always, we've budgeted some time for your questions for Heather on the back end of our conversations. So don't be shy about that. Just raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you so that we'll get in as many questions as we can before our time is up. But with that said, Heather McGhee, welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's a real honor to be here.
Well, we are delighted to have you, and we're excited about the young adult version of The Sum of Us, How Racism Hurts Everyone. We've got lots of ground to cover, so we'll see how far we get. But of course, Heather, the thread that runs through the book is the idea of the zero-sum mentality that we have had in this country. More specifically, that, any gain for you is a loss for me, and to get even more specific, that if black people win, white people lose. And that has been kind of the thread that has run through. And you use the example of a swimming pool in Alabama as a literal illustration of the zero-sum mentality and what that looks like. What happened there?
Yeah. So first of all, I just have to say thank you to everyone for coming out here this evening as we sort of re-enter society and enjoy one another's company and ideas in person. It's really a pleasure. Thank you so much for being willing to be in conversation with me tonight, and of course to the Free Library of Philadelphia for hosting me. In the 1930s and 40s, the country went on a building boom of public goods. And this building boom included public goods like libraries and roads and bridges and schools and these swimming pools that were not the kinds of swimming pools that I think of when I think of a kind of neighborhood pool, but they were these big, grand resort-style pools, many of which could hold thousands of swimmers at a time. And they were, like most public goods, not just in the Jim Crow South, but across the country, either explicitly or just by custom and enforced through intimidation and violence, often segregated and for whites only. And I think about these public goods in terms of the real physical swimming pools, but of course also the economic public goods that are so important to me in my career as an economic policy advocate. Public goods like Social Security and the massive investment in housing that came out of the Great Depression and the GI Bill and workers' rights laws, right? All these public goods that expressed this ethos that said that government had a role to play in ensuring a decent quality of life for people. So all of these were public goods, but then the swimming pools were just kind of like this glittering kind of cherry on the top, right? The idea that not only is the government going to make sure you retire well, but, when you're working and, this was before elaborate camps and internships and things that kids are doing these days, you could just let them play by the pool all summer long and they'd be safe, right? And so there were so many of these pools. So many of them were segregated, as I said. And on the literal journey that I took to write The Sum of Us, I found myself in Montgomery, Alabama. And it actually happened by accident. I had an infant son, and so playgrounds were increasingly important to me. And I was there to do a bunch of interviews, to see the EJI museum and all of that. But we just looked on Google Maps to find a park. And we ended up at Oak Park, which is sort of the big central park, this beautiful park. And I found myself walking across this big, wide, flat expanse. And I learned that buried 10 feet underground is the carcass of what used to be 1,000+ person public swimming pool. And that what happened to turn one of the biggest pools in the South into dirt was that a federal court issued a desegregation order. And instead of integrating the pool and complying with the courts, the City Council of Montgomery, Alabama voted to, effective January 1st, 1959, drain the public swimming pool, fill it in, close that park I was in, Oak Park, close the entire city of Montgomery's Parks and Recreation Department entirely. They sold off the animals in the zoo. And they kept it closed for a decade rather than integrate. From 1959 to 1969, there was no Montgomery Parks and Recreation. So, that's just crazy, right? It's both unbelievable and yet totally believable, right? And for me, it was a real aha about what is kind of the core mystery that was guiding my journey. The mystery that compelled me to leave my job in economic policy, which was, why are we sabotaging ourselves? Why is it that we went from being the country with the greatest middle class the world had ever seen to record inequality? Why are we doing this to ourselves? I knew how we had done it to ourselves. I knew the changes in tax policy and trade policy and the changes in public investment and all that, but I didn't understand why until I came across that drained pool. And it made something make sense to me about basically that zero-sum thinking, white support for public goods really drying up once it meant all of the public, even members of the public that they had been taught were not good.
Well, and that brings us then to the subtitle of the book, right? Which is that racism hurts everyone, because when the pool gets filled in, nobody swims.
Yeah, that's right.
So everybody suffers.
Yeah. And it's really important, and in some ways it was, I was just at a school today. Really, it's been wonderful. I just have to take a quick moment. So I've been promoting this book now for the past 2 weeks, which is for middle and high school students. So I've gone into middle schools and high schools and libraries, and the kids are all right. They're just asking the smartest questions. They are so with it. They get it in a minute. I haven't had to dumb it down. It's like a kind of a complicated book with lots of data, and it's just been really wonderful. So one of the questions that I got asked today was, were you worried that the book would be controversial? And I was worried that it would be controversial because any book about race and racism in a country that is so woefully miseducated about its own history is controversial. But also because it wasn't just going to be controversial to the people who say they're not racist but don't want to learn about racism, but also the people who say they're racial justice advocates, right? I thought maybe people who were many of my close friends in the racial justice movement would say, why are you focusing on white people? Right? Why are you expanding the aperture to talk about the costs not just to us but to white people? And I was fully prepared for that. I had some friends lined up to, go to war on Twitter for me and, all of that. but in a way that I still haven't quite put my finger on why it is. There has not been that backlash. I really make the point that racism in our politics and our policymaking is so extensive, even more so than I really understood after 20 years of working in economic policy, that it would be quite hard for anybody who wasn't very wealthy and powerful and protected to escape the impacts of that distorting factor of racism in our politics and our policymaking.
I'm glad you brought all of that up and you talked about that question about whether you were concerned that the book would be controversial, because at a time when books are being banned in this country, at a time when there has been such a backlash against the teaching of African American history, African American studies, we're looking at what's happening in Florida, and I wonder, do you see that as just another example of the zero-sum game?
That's exactly right. My editor, tremendous human being, thoughtful, courageous, smart, his name is Christopher Jackson. He runs an imprint called One World Publishing. It's part of Penguin Random House. And he, as soon as the book was out, we had, a celebratory toast 6 feet apart in a very cold backyard. And he said, this is great. It's doing so well. Let's start talking about the paperback and the afterword I want you to write. And I was like, what are you talking about? I was like absolutely offended. I was like, I just gave it all. Like, I left everything on the field. I have nothing left. This is not a blog post. I'm not going to be updating this every 6 months. Like, what are you talking about? I mean, I was really offended. I was exhausted. I was offended. But he said, no, we're going to have a paperback in a year and there needs to be new material and there's lots going on in society. And I'd really dragged my heels. But then, so the book came out in, I think, February, late January of 2021. And, we began to see all of these positive things happen in society. The American Rescue Plan, the child tax credit, the freezing of student loan payments, and, all these things that actually I write about as the nice things that we haven't been able to have. So there was that. But then we did begin to see that first legislative season of the anti-critical race theory bills and the bills attacking our children's freedom to learn. And I definitely had a lot to say about it, and so the paperback of the adult version has an afterword where I really kind of rip into it. I think it is a zero-sum story. It's a story that says that it's either Black history or American history, and there is no both, right? And that, in fact, Black history is somehow threatening to U.S. history. It's a drained pool strategy, fundamentally, right? Because what is it doing? It's creating chaos in our public schools and libraries. Right, when you see those pictures of the empty shelves, right, doesn't that just make you think of the drained pool, right? And it's helping. There was been a massive, exodus of teachers from the system, and a lot of that had to do with the pandemic. And remember, before the pandemic, there were marches and strikes all over the country for higher teacher pay, right? There's a lot going on, but this, when I talk to educators, feels like just the straw that breaks the camel's back. The idea that fundamentally they are going to be watched and policed for what they might teach their children. And it's a drain pool strategy because the target is, of course, white parents, right? It's saying, white parents fear this integrated public good. It's threatening to your children. And, take your kids and their tax dollars out of here. And, when I speak to kind of people who, think about the sort of long arc of public education, they do see this as the ultimate economic goal, is the privatization of as much of the system as possible. And so I do think it's a drained pool strategy. But I also think it's backfiring. I look at the polling numbers every couple of months on this stuff, and it's wildly unpopular, right? 88% of the country believes we should teach the great part of American history and the bad parts of American history. Only 13% of the country thinks that we should, this is a different poll, that we should ever ban books having to do with race and racism. 50% of the country thinks we should never ban books for any reason. Right? It just strikes most Americans as profoundly un-American. And I think it's a massive overreach. And I think when you begin to see the way that it's creating crisis in our schools, and educators are having to respond to public records requests and lawsuits and all that, where they're just trying to get our kids back on track, I do think that it is backfiring.
Yeah. You also write that the government, in a sense, drained the pool when it comes to access to a college education, speaking of education. Obviously, it's become much more expensive. Anybody who has been to college or put kids through college recently knows how expensive it is. It often requires loans, especially for students of color. Even as we're having this conversation, the Supreme Court is deciding about President Biden's loan forgiveness program and whether that's going to happen or not. And I wonder if you could talk about that as yet another potential drain the pool strategy, and sort of how you're thinking about the way that we're looking at college education right now.
Yeah. This is an example that I use a lot with the students, as you can imagine, right? Near and dear to them. And they just don't understand, many of them don't know that public college used to be virtually free, right? Some of the biggest systems, New York, California, used to be truly tuition free. And that wasn't because it didn't cost anything, right? It was because government picked up the tab in terms of state funding for public colleges, where 75% of students in the country go, by the way, the public system. And then whatever was left over in terms of the cost of running these schools was modest tuition, right? Hundreds of dollars, and you could get a federal grant that didn't have to be paid back, and not just a loan. And there was a real shift that was a part of this new politics in the decades following the civil rights movement, when you saw a real public opinion shift from the majority of white Americans really being very supportive of a robust role for government in the economy, and a robust role for government in sort of playing that role of taking care of kind of the basics, right? Making sure that there's this foundation of economic security, to lots more anti-government sentiment, more pro-tax cut sentiment, this sort of, something that was a public good, like the pool, becoming a private luxury and a private cost. And that happened to coincide, that decreased enthusiasm by politicians for funding public colleges, with the college-going population becoming more diverse. And so I see it as a drain pool strategy, both in, literally the cost of public college has gone up, largely because of cutbacks in the per pupil funding for public college systems from the government, and the shift from grants to loans. But I also see it as a racism costs everyone kind of example, right? Because of the exclusion of Black families from all those economic public goods that I described, right? Social Security, the massive investment in housing, the GI Bill, right? Whether it was explicit, as in the housing sector, or Social Security, which excluded the two job categories that most Black workers were in, or the GI Bill was race neutral on its face, but the benefits were in housing and education, which are highly segregated sectors, right? You don't have that intergenerational wealth, right? And so more Black students have to borrow, because intergenerational wealth, even if it's a modest amount, it's like, your grandpa's starter home, right? Your aunt's $10,000 in GM stock, like whatever it is. I'm not saying excess wealth. I'm just saying a little bit of something more than a paycheck has really been determinative for so many families. So 8 out of 10 Black students have to borrow because they don't have that to draw from, but 6 out of 10 white students have to borrow too, right? And everyone in our economy is feeling the impacts of $2 trillion almost in student loan debt. In the Supreme Court oral arguments, one of the conservative justices was trying to pull this whole fairness thing by saying that, why should a student get their loans canceled? I like to say canceled and not forgiven, because forgiven sort of suggests that the students did something wrong, right? That the student loans should be canceled when a small business person with a lawn care business, is not getting their loans canceled. Well, first of all, if a small business goes belly up, they can file for bankruptcy, and student loans are not dischargeable in bankruptcy. They stay with you forever. Lots of businesses got PPP loans, which were completely forgiven, right? Very short memory we seem to have of those hundreds of billions of dollars. But even beside that, it's this zero-sum framing that says that, this small business owner should resent somebody else in his community having a little bit more financial freedom, when in fact, what does a lawn care small business owner really need? Neighbors to be able to buy houses. Right? I mean, it was like one of the worst examples you could actually give, right? Because we know that for every $1,000 in additional student loans that a family has, the home ownership rate in that income quintile goes down by a percentage point, right? And it makes, of course, it makes sense. So it's just nonsense, but it's such zero-sum framing. Fortunately, again, people aren't buying it. People think that this crazy debt for diploma system is no way to run a country. The loan cancellation policy is popular with 60-something% of the country. So I do think that the sort of zero-sum logic as the kind of go-to scare tactic against any kind of public investments is having less and less currency than it did even when I started writing the book.
Heather, you wrote something that really struck me, and I realized after I kind of researched it, it's not a new statistic. But I was struck by it. You made a statement that said, and I'm quoting, because of the racist exclusion from U.S. wealth-building policies, white high school dropouts typically have more family wealth than do black college graduates. Is that still true? And how does that happen?
Yeah, it is still true. Wealth is where history shows up in your wallet, right? We all know that money begets money. That when you have access to a little bit of a cushion, as I was, describing, and it doesn't have to be a lot, it allows you to get more wealth, right? It takes money to make money, right? There are all of these adages. I remember, having this very vivid experience with one of my coworkers at Demos when I first started working there. I went to fancy private schools that I'm still paying for, but that's beside the point. And she was, her parents were from the middle of Ohio. Her dad was a steel worker, and her mom was a waitress, right? And she was like, I'm a working class girl, and that was like her identity. And, we were great friends, but we had this sort of thing where, like, I was black, but I had this sort of pedigree, and my mom is an intellectual, and she was, working class. But when we started working on the issue of student debt, I assumed she had student debt too, but she didn't. And she explained that, like, her dad's union had a tuition benefit. Her dad had stock in the company that he sold to pay for her college tuition, that her aunt had left her something when she sold her house, and all this stuff. And I was like, whoa, where was this coming from? It was really not, my parents didn't even own houses until I was in college, right? So it's just that way in which, in this statistic, a black college graduate has done all the things, right? Has gone to college, has gotten a great job, has a higher income than a white high school dropout. And yet what that college graduate can't do is she can't go back in time and make sure that her grandparents weren't redlined out of owning a home. And that's really why that racial wealth divide is one of the most important salient factors in how we think about economic opportunity. And one of the really significant parts of the story of wealth accumulation and then theft and loss is not just, the stories like Black Wall Street and Tulsa and, the Rosewood, those violent moments, but also the loss of black farmland and the example all across this country of thriving black communities in the middle of the last century being destroyed by eminent domain to make room for highways. And those black businesses and banks and insurance companies, lost so much that they can never, that was really taken in a way that will never be recovered without the same race sensitivity to building wealth that we had for so much of our history for denying wealth to black communities.
want to shift gears a little bit and talk about voting, because that is another area of zero sum, and we all know that, especially in recent years, there have been numerous states that have tightened up their voting restrictions and made it more difficult for people to vote. Lots of state legislatures have done that, and of course, these measures tend to disproportionately affect voters of color. I wonder if you could talk about that and how they ultimately negatively affect everybody. Yeah. White voters suffer from that as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you know, when I was at Demos, we focused on inequality in our economy and our democracy, and we saw those two things as really linked. And I would say, even as someone who often did a lot of work in the space of voting rights advocacy, I did not know the full extent of the racist history of voter suppression until I started researching this book. The violence, just the wiliness, you know, the creation of every trick in the book out of the fear of Black political power. And as I did throughout the process of writing the book, I kept sort of trying to have radical empathy and put myself sort of back in the shoes of people at that time, and think of counterfactuals. Well, what if there hadn't been this fear, right? What really would have happened if Black people had been allowed to vote after the violent end of Reconstruction at the rates that they should have? Like, would it have meant, white people losing everything, right? And I looked back at that period of time, and I saw what Black voters were demanding, right? What were the politics? And so often, both then and both in Reconstruction, so right after the Civil War, when the Union Army made possible, the enfranchisement of millions of former enslaved people, that their political program was education, was public investment, was an end to corporate consolidation and debt. It was just like a sort of prairie populist type of agenda. And then again, in the wake of the Civil Rights Movement and the Voting Rights Act, when usually still white politicians then had to actually court votes across the racial spectrum in the South, their agenda was like kindergarten, was streetlights, right? It was the type of things that working class and middle class families of all races really needed, and it changed what they ran on because they couldn't just run catering only on a racial agenda. And so, similarly, when we think about Georgia, for example, right? It's heavily contested, lots of barriers put up to the ballot, but also a ton of movement building and infrastructure building to get, all people to the polls of every race and background, and just record turnout in the mass number of elections, including these special elections themselves, which were created to try to diminish Black political power. And what was the agenda, for example, of the most recent Georgia election? Raphael Warnock, who was running for re-election, was running on $35 insulin and student loan debt cancellation, right? It ultimately is an illusory fear, right? It's a fear of a loss that has never been borne out. Now, the gain for people of color through political power has been borne out, right? It has fundamentally improved things throughout our history, but not at the expense of white people.
I want to talk too about the Electoral College, because as you know, that there has been a lot of talk in recent years about the idea of abolishing it. We've seen how a candidate can lose the popular vote and win the election.
Many times now.
Yeah, and you've written about that, and I wonder if you could explain the Electoral College's connection to slavery, and then, of course, the impact that it has on modern day elections.
Yeah. So this is one of those things that, I didn't know until I started researching the book. But 9 of the first 13 presidents of the United States were from Virginia. That kind of makes no sense, right? I'm pretty sure it's 9 out of 13. Why? How? Right? It was because in order to create the 13 colony, now states, compromise that was the signing of the Constitution, there had to be a lot of concessions to the slave states. And one of them was, of course, the 3/5 Compromise, right, which created a system of apportionment for Congress that included everybody who was a white person, and also 3/5 of all other persons not taxed, which of course was enslaved people, right? So it inflated the political power of slave states by counting the people who were then counted as property as people, but only to aggrandize the political power of their owners. And then attached to that was a system that James Madison knew was silly. I don't think that's exactly the word he used, but he said that it was not the most obvious and democratic way to elect a president. That would have been direct election of the president. But creating an electoral college where the apportionment was attached to those rigged numbers was a way to ensure that the slave states would sign the Constitution, because they knew they'd have a thumb on the scale. And that was really important to them. And so that's how we still have the Electoral College, which has given us, in my lifetime, 3 Republican presidents. And however, we are very close to something called the Multi-State Compact, which would make enough states having decided that voluntarily they would assign their electors to the person who wins the popular vote, that we actually could change that. So stay tuned.
Heather, there are modern-day pool drainers, if you will, who fear what America is becoming, as demographically America becomes browner than it's ever been and less white than it has ever been. But you write that what some perceive as the undoing of America could actually be its salvation. Unpack that idea.
I'm just a very oddly patriotic person. I think I'm patriotic because because I'm the descendant of enslaved people on both sides of my family. My family's history so tracks U.S. history, right? The Great Migration, all of that. We are America, right? I mean, we are nothing else but, right? And that is such an important part of my pride in my ancestors. I was very lucky to have great-grandparents. My grandmother, Marcia McGhee, who's quoted in the book, just passed away 5 weeks ago at 96. When I was young, I had great-grandparents who were in their hundreds. I was very connected to and proud of the history of our contributions to this country and the way in which our family story sort of weaved into big movements in U.S. history and big movements of people. And so it's funny because my husband is much more of an internationalist, and he's sort of like, why are you so stuck on this country? Can't we just go somewhere else? And I feel like, no, I have to stay here and fight. So I think that is a piece of the feeling I have, that where I want to redeem this country, I want to make all the blood spilled worth something. I want to have a humanist approach that says that because all the world's peoples have met here, and we could finally realize our common humanity, and that to be patriotic to a country this diverse and this full of peoples from all over the world is to not be kind of jingoistic or nationalistic, but rather truly someone who just loves humanity. And I do think that one of the things that is a hallmark of this country is our youth, right? Is our sometimes pathological, ahistorical nature, our desire to renew, our incredible creative energy, our openness, and that we could use that to our benefit and say that we are not bound to the sins and the lies of some of the worst people who've ever lived, right, who created so much pain in our history. But we could sort of elevate a new set of heroes. That's one of the things that always gets me when people want to suppress our history. It's like, but if you don't know that, then you can't find the real heroism of people who stood up against the odds. And they're right there, right? White, black, and brown, they're right there. There's so many heroes that we should be, and sheroes, obviously, that we should be elevating. And you don't know how courageous they were and how amazing they were if you don't know just how brutal and total the system of the lie of white supremacy was. But we have all these heroes that we could elevate. We could rewrite our story in a way that takes the good and the bad and sort of pushes us into a future where there is no racial majority. You know, when I talk to students now, I'm talking to the America that is becoming, where they are already in a generation where there's no racial majority numerically, right? And that's why I think it could be our salvation if we could reignite the fundamental economic promise of the 20th century, the American dream, for a generation without the limitations of caste and color. Like, this could be something really special. And that's why I have that optimism.
Which leads me to my final question, and that is, you end the book with a challenge to us to refill the pool. What might that look like, practically speaking?
Well, you know, I've got to say, I've been working in policy, trying to refill that pool since I was 22, so now 20 years. And we're closer than we've ever been, right? So many of the nice things that I opened the book bemoaning that they're out of our reach are within our reach now, have been put right in the center of the agenda. And, you know, I mean, a big part of what shaped me economically as a kid was that I grew up in Chicago in a moment of deindustrialization and job loss, a loss of manufacturing jobs. We have more manufacturing jobs in the US than we have since the 1970s. Right? That's huge, right? The Inflation Reduction Act was more of a commitment to, you know, decarbonizing and greening our economy and creating more opportunities for homeowners and renters to save on clean energy. The kind of like just planning and industrial policy that any self-respecting country should be doing, we are doing now. So, you know, the fact that I used to be laughed out of the halls of Congress talking about the problem of student debt. I mean, we really had Democrats and Republicans saying that student debt was good debt. 15 years ago, 10 years ago, right? And now, you know, we've got a whole different agenda. And so I think it would look like making sure that the basics that are in common for most families, childcare, paid family leave, you know, a great public school in every neighborhood, a great system of public infrastructure in a country whose infrastructure used to be the envy of the world, and that's human and hard infrastructure. I think we should look at the idea of making sure that there is a job for everyone in this country. There is work to be done. And nobody should be idle unnecessarily or have to work in fast food when they really want to take care of other human beings and they really want to be a part of saving our planet. So I think there are a lot of ideas, and what's crazy to me, honestly, is that they're no longer fringe ideas as they were for most of my career. And so I'm very optimistic that we have already begun to refill the pool, that wages have been have increased for the lowest paid workers through movement building and policy, and that, at the height of the pandemic, the poverty level was the lowest level it had been on record through smart public policy and public spending on behalf of our people. What could be more important?
Hi, good evening, and thank you so much for being here. I'm so happy to see you in person.
Thank you.
We know that our health care system is different here than the rest of the world. I was wondering if it is also connected to the racial empty
That's right.
pool
Yep.
situation.
Yeah, really good question. Thank you. Short answer, yes. In fact, when we look at our healthcare system where we spend more than our peers and have worse outcomes, racism really stopped us from filling in the pool in the first place. Right? It was Harry Truman who first proposed national health insurance in the 1940s, and it was the Dixiecrat segregationist caucus in his party that said no way, that equal health care would be a threat to Jim Crow. And it was defeated really along those lines. And then the closest thing we have to universal health care, of course, was signed into law by the first African-American president on party lines. And right after Obamacare, as it's known, was signed, the majority of white Americans opposed it. And social scientists looked at, okay, well, what is it? Is it the pre-existing conditions? Is it the shopping marketplace? Is it the tax credits? What is so terrible about this, right? And when they asked them each individual policy, it was like, yeah, that sounds fine. That's fine. That's fine too. That's fine. Yeah, that's fine, right? But somehow the idea of a government support, really, for healthcare, right? Because it didn't include a public option, right? Government support for healthcare, particularly when the face of the government was who it was, triggered anti-government sentiment. And then, of course, we had a Supreme Court use a states' rights legal theory, alarm bells should always go off, to say that the coverage heart of Obamacare was unconstitutional because the federal government can't force states to do what they don't want to do, and expand Medicaid, expand the income limits so that working class people could actually afford health care. And so then as soon as that was struck down, you had a new Mason-Dixon line of health care, where most of the former Confederate states did not expand Medicaid, and most of the former Union states did, right? And so race is so much a part of our healthcare history and our present. And then, of course, the pandemic is just another example in ways that maybe we can get into or we don't have to, but ways in which systemic racism and actually political racism has cost us all so much.
I totally enjoyed your lecture.
Oh, thank
I learned
you.
a lot. Do you think Obama's presidency improved race relations, or did it worsen? And of course, the backlash, a lot of people say Trump was the backlash, after Obama.
Yeah, that's a good question. So when I was digging into the social science data, the correlation between the sort of racialization of folks' views of what is otherwise kind of race-neutral public policy, the minimum wage, healthcare, even drilling in the Arctic, really heightened in the Obama era. I don't know if you guys remember like Nancy Pelosi and Newt Gingrich sitting on a couch talking about how we were going to address climate change. I don't know if you guys remember that, right? But under President Obama, you began to see all of these things that required government solutions become immediately toxic to most white moderates and conservatives, and it was more toxic the more that those voters had anti-Black beliefs. So you began to see a sort of racial polarization on things that were not even kind of racial, right? Now, I hesitate to say or even suggest that that is President Obama's fault, you know? But it is true that a tried and true strategy among those who were profiting economically from a weak government and from sort of self-sabotaging anti-government sentiment used that old vulnerability and began to use it and deploy it strategically. Right, we began to see, for example, just staying on the environment, right, we began to see ads talking about climate change, not in terms of, you know, what we could save and what we need to do, but rather in terms of coal miners' jobs being taken away by big government, right? And whose face is the face of the coal miner? Who is the face of big government, right? And who's running those ads? It's the Koch brothers and other oil and coal profiteers, right? And so it was a lot of increasing strategy, which you also saw in the political discourse around healthcare and government spending, period, right? Remember the sort of mania around the need to tighten the purse strings under President Obama, right? Which, of course, flew out the window, you know, the next administration. And so, yes, like we have to acknowledge the impact that those racialized strategies had on our politics. But what also happened is that we saw polarization in another way, in which white Americans who did choose to vote for President Obama and for the Democrats in that era became more liberal on racial issues, right? And it was sort of like, if you're white, you're a Democrat because you wouldn't mind hanging out with Barack and Michelle Obama. Like, you know, like that became, kind of the fault line, right? And that has been really important for creating a multiracial, anti-racist majority that we have today in the largest social demonstration movement in American history in 2020, the vast majority of which happened in majority white counties, right? So I think it was salient and powerful, but I'm not cynical about it, and I certainly don't blame the president for anything he did or said, because it was not a racial firebrand, let me put it that way.
I also want to thank you so much for being here. I'm in a tight spot, so I'm not going to stand. But my question goes back to your comments around wealth and the racial wealth gap. It's something that I'm thinking about quite frequently. And you made a statement, you can't go back in time. So I wonder what your thoughts on about how we might start to address issues around the racial wealth gap, given the fact that we don't have a time machine, and also how we might start talking about the issue, given the fact that it has this structural racism baked into it.
Yeah, I think that when it comes down, thank you for the question. I think that when it comes down to solutions for the racial wealth gap, home ownership is the biggest, the biggest piece of a family's wealth portfolio, right? Only about half of Americans own any stocks at all. Right, so that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about houses. And then at the same time, I was in a high school today and a young Black student raised her hand and talked about how her family was trying to sell their home and they had it appraised and it was undervalued because it was clear that it was a Black family. And then they got a reappraisal where they just had one of their parents' white friends sit in the house the whole time. And it was appraised for $200,000 more. Wow. Right? So it's home ownership, right? But it's also home ownership free of discrimination and bias is an important piece. And there are policies that can really make it easier for example, all of these young Black college graduates and adults who are actually home ownership ready. There's an Urban League study that found 3 million sort of home ownership ready, kind of millennials and Gen Z and not Gen Z, millennial homeowners, would-be homeowners that were ready, and there were just a few things that would make it possible, right? So I think a really targeted homeownership strategy in the Black community could really go a long way. I do think we need to not be afraid of reparations. We need to not be afraid of reparations. I think that they are seed capital for the nation that we're becoming. I think that when you understand the full history of this nation, not just slavery, though we can by no means diminish that and the economic impact of stolen labor, but also of the 20th century of exclusion from all the asset building policies, then we have to say, in fact, it's really important that the entity that did the excluding, right, that drew the redlining maps, that gave the subsidies on the condition that they would only go to people wholly of the Caucasian race, needs to have a role in making amends. Thank you. And it doesn't need to be a zero sum, right? It's not like, the government's gonna come and knock on every white person's door and say, write a check to your nearest Black person, right? That's not the way public policy works, That's not the way we think of it when we spend trillions of dollars in defense, We're not like, woo, 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 they're coming for me, we did a podcast also called The Sum of Us this year. And the second to last episode takes place in Manhattan Beach, California, where there's this case of reparations for a Black family that was run out of town and their land was taken by eminent domain. And in it, I reflect on kind of not just, the financial piece and all that, but also just the sense of peace that everyone should have, knowing that we live in a society where there is some justice. Right, where if the government does something really wrong, I want to know that at some point they will make amends. Like, that just makes me feel better, even if I'm not somebody who has a grievance and a record. I just want to live in that kind of society, right? And so I think that we can all, and I think, frankly, it's really important for white people to speak up and say, you know what, this doesn't scare me. Maybe even this gives me a sense of peace. Maybe even this makes me feel great about the economy in the future, that we have Black people who have contributed so much to this country's wealth, being the full participants in it, for future generations. That's actually important to me.
Glad you're here. We read your book in our anti-racist book club.
Oh, thank you.
I'm an artist, and I have a show up right now called Engine of Racism. And it is about, I think, greed is the engine of racism.
Yeah.
And racism was constructed to be sure that the money funneled to the wealthy by dividing the whites from the blacks.
That's right.
Starting with the Bacon Rebellion in Virginia, which is where Bill and I are from. And I would love to invite you to the show. There's a reception this Saturday.
Everybody should go.
It's at the Muse Gallery, which is in Old City, right next to the Arden Theater. But it strikes me that your book is right to the point of making white people and Black people understand how we are all in the same stew. This is all of our history. This is not Black history alone by any means. And I think it's why there's such an effort to keep children from learning our history is that then we see what everyone's losing except the very wealthy who are doing all the gaining.
Well said. Thank you.
Thank you so very much.
All right. Engine of greed. Engine of racism. Engines of racism. Thank you. Muse Gallery.
Is there anything that you wish that you would have changed about your book, like, that you dislike?
I'm telling you, young people have the best questions. So in the course of going, I wrote the book between basically 2017 and 2021. It came out in the winter of 2021, January, February. And then in 2022, I went back out on the road to create the audio documentary, the podcast, The Sum of Us. And in doing that journey and that story collection, I found out more about the history of Black enclaves of businesses and schools and wealth being destroyed by the highway system, by eminent domain, by local policymakers saying, well, that's our least valuable property, and so we're going to sort of undervalue that property and have that be where the highway goes through. And there was something really, it was very emotional. Like, I ended up going to half a dozen places where this had happened and where, you saw pictures of just these thriving Black communities just gone. And it was very emotional. And it also reminded me that I wish that I had said more about the resilience of Black people and countered the narrative that, like, we never had nothing, and that, like, we can't ever have anything, right? And shown more of a light on, just take the Greenwood Black Wall Street story, right? Violent firebombing, conspiracy to deny insurance claims, 1921. But very few people know outside of Oklahoma that by the 1950s, it was built back up again. And then a highway was sited through it, right? So I think that piece that doesn't pathologize Black people and says that, with the same sets, never with the same sets of investments, but with any smidgen of opportunity, we can make great things and have the kinds of American dream that, other folks have. I think it's a really important part of the story, and I wish I had kind of done more to make that point. Thank you.
Heather, where can we find the podcast?
Oh, anywhere podcasts are sold for free. Spotify produced it, but it's on Apple and all the stuff. So it's just called The Sum of Us.
Yeah. Please join me, ladies and gentlemen, in thanking Heather McGhee for being with us tonight.
Thank you. Oh, thank you very much. Thank you.